Hi, everybody. Welcome to Dispatches from Quarantine at San Francisco Creative Writing Institute at CounterPulse Theater. I'm Alexandra Kostoulis. I'm the founder and executive director of the SF Creative Writing Institute. I also teach a number of classes here, and we're pleased to invite you to a special Dispatches from Quarantine, Kristina Wong in conversation with Rebecca Solnit. And this event is going to be the two amazing writers from San Francisco talking about how the pandemic has affected the field of creative writing and in particular performance and storytelling in our culture. I'm going to read you a little bit about each of them. Kristina Wong is a Doris Duke Award winner, Guggenheim Fellow, and a Pulitzer Prize finalist in drama. She's a performance artist, comedian, actor, and writer who has been presented internationally across North America, the UK, Hong Kong, and Africa. Her work has been awarded with support from Creative Capital, the MAP Fund, Center for Cultural Innovation, National Performance Network, a COLA Master Artist Fellowship from the Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs, 9 Los Angeles Artist in Residence Award, Center Theater Group Sherwood Award, and the Art Matters Foundation, and many others. She also has a show coming up in the spring at ACT Theater. Rebecca Solnit is the author of more than 20 books on feminism, Western and urban history, popular power, social change and insurrection, wandering and walking, hope and catastrophe. Her most recent publication is the Climate Anthology, co-edited with Thelma Young Lutunanabua, titled Not Too Late, Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility. Other books include Orwell's Roses, Recollections of My Non-Existence, Hope in the Dark, which I first encountered in 2004 and made me really love her work, and of course, Men Explain Things to Me, and others. She's a regular contributor to many well-known international publications like The Guardian and LitHub, and she serves on the board of the climate group Oil Change International. She's really one of the foremost cultural critics in the U.S. Without further ado, allow me to welcome Kristina Wong in conversation with Rebecca Solnit.
Hello! We fight!
Okay,
So,
are our mics on?
I think so.
You can all hear us and stuff, right? Thank you.
So I guess I'll just sort of start of how we got here together to talk about everyone's favorite subject, the pandemic. So fun, yay. Let's see. So basically, it was deemed non-essential in March 2020, as all artists and a lot of professions were. And I sew my set pieces and props for my shows. I've sewn things like a giant vagina costume, well, my friend sewed the penis, but I just sewed the pubes on it. So I never made medical equipment before, and we found ourselves in a situation where there was how Hitchcock is that? Well, we found ourselves in a situation where there were no masks, which was just like such a weird thing, right? When this all started. And I got excited that I had one essential skill and decided to deploy it. And I will say 3 years later, I ended up where I never imagined I would have been 3 years ago, with a show about it called Kristina Wong Sweatshop Overlord, and which is coming to ACT in the spring. So please come back and break the tenderloin and come back and watch it. But I'll go ahead and read the intro that I wrote while we get this mic issue resolved. This is...
Kristina, we could just pass it back and forth.
Sure.
Like a joint too.
Yeah, okay.
But you go read.
Okay, well, I'll read and then I'll puff pass my mic to Rebecca. But this is the Anti-Sewing Squad Guide to Mask Making, Radical Care, and Racial Justice. So this is a book that had to be put together very quickly. We actually didn't even know who the new president would be when we turned in the draft for this. I guess the publishing process takes a year to go through peer edits and stuff, but it was sort of this wing and prayer that we were going to document this crazy thing that we had witnessed, which is this remote mask sewing group. This was written August 2020. When I first started the Anti-Sewing Squad, the thinking was, when factory-made masks become readily available on the market, we will retire. What I didn't realize then was that tens of thousands of people in America can't access even cheap factory-made masks. Communities long forgotten by the federal government before the pandemic were now getting hit extra hard. Never did I imagine that I would pull my mother and her friends out of retirement to order them around my remote sweatshop. Never did I imagine that I would be politicizing the term sweatshop to point to the federal government's failure in preparing us for this crisis. Never did I imagine how politically polarizing the act of wearing a mask would become. Never did I imagine how political the act of sewing two pieces of fabric together for a total stranger could be. Never did I imagine how many aunties from all over North America would rage stitch with us. And never did I plan for the group to make a book. Before I became the factory overlord of the Auntie Sewing Squad, family, cult, labor camp, amateur medical supply company, shadow government aid agency, I was a performance artist who was scheduled to embark on a national tour of Kristina Wong for public office, a show about how I ran for and won a seat on my neighborhood council. In the before times, I sewed my set pieces and props. Never did I imagine that I would be using my half-assed home ec skills previously used to stitch fabric ruffles into giant labia shapes to make life-saving medical equipment, with used bed sheets and conference lanyards at that. I'm becoming the overlord of a Chinese sweatshop, I declared, when the first volunteers to step forward were mostly Chinese and Asian American women. It wasn't hard to see the irony of college-educated Asian American women whose parents and grandparents did invisible, back-breaking garment labor to pay their debt to the American dream, now performing that same work, like some kind of ancestral destiny. This time they were doing it for no pay and with far less appreciation from others of the time and skill that sewing requires, as we've become a country Amazon primed for instant satisfaction without consideration for the workers who make our things. And even after much American manufacturing moved to China, here we were, diasporic Asians, trying to put together an ad hoc assembly line from our home sewing machines. Oh, America, the land of opportunity. No craft store, not even fucking Joanne Fabric and Craft Store, was prepared for the 2020 trend of sewing cloth masks to stop the spread of COVID-19. Every vendor in the country ran out of elastic, and fabric and factory-made masks were out of stock for weeks. I was like Robinson Crusoe, and my desert island was my home in Koreatown, Los Angeles, waving down every hobbyist seamstress on Facebook for leads on where to find elastic. Aunties were chopping the straps off their bras, sawing the elastic off their fitted bed sheets, knitting I-cord from scraps of yarn. No t-shirt was safe, no half-finished quilt project too precious to sacrifice for DIY personal protective equipment. In the early days of the pandemic, because this shit has gone on so long, enough for me to separate it into different eras, I was running in and out of my home 10 times a day with fistfuls of elastic, meeting mass strangers to whom I'd given my address on the internet because they had offered to help sew. I was buying dressmaking shops out of their stores of elastic for cash and immediately mailing spools away to strangers in other cities, even if the postage cost as much as the spools. Some of these strangers became aunties in our group. Others I had to trust were going to make good on their promise to sew masks for essential workers out there, not just resell them on Etsy. In a moment of desperation, Auntie Karen offered her son's well-washed underwear to us for its elastic and cotton fabric. We declined, but we did consider it. As dozens of new aunties flooded into our group, I shifted away from my sewing machine to become a supervisor, orienting new aunties to the group. I'm going to skip down. The great irony of this mask-making empire was that before the first Los Angeles lockdown, I refused to wear a mask. As an Asian American, I was already walking around with a mask I couldn't take off. The mask that said to the world, hey, blame me for the coronavirus. Adding a mask on top of my existing mask would bring attention to that. Even as a performance artist, I wasn't looking for that attention. But building ass, which I didn't realize was our acronym until a week after I made the Facebook group, has been a radical experiment in generosity, intersectional alliances, and a paradigm outside of capitalism. I never set out to lead a remote sweatshop empire during the apocalypse, but that's where unprecedented times take us. Like finding out that an old pillowcase can yield 5 masks, we discover all sorts of things about ourselves that we didn't know were possible. If you ever wanted to exploit unpaid manual labor, coerce children to help you, and be lauded as a hero, you have come to the right place. Or at least landed in a moment of American history where it's become clear we have no leadership, No supply chain, no infrastructure, and definitely no quarter-inch flat braided elastic. If this is the end, we go down sewing. Right? Great. So I'm going to pass the joint. So Auntie Rebecca did not sew any masks, but there's a lot of nicknames among our aunties. We have a survivalist auntie, we have haggle aunties, we have baby aunties. Auntie Rebecca is the historian writer shakedown auntie. So I'll pass that over.
Wasn't there another microphone used by the person who introduced us? No? No? Oh, okay. Well then, we will just pass the joint. What was I going to say? I heard about the anti-sewing squad from Auntie Valerie Sew, who is an old friend of Kristina's, I think, and a really old friend of mine. Val and I met in the 1980s, around 1987, I think. And she told me about the squad, and I was immediately interested. I wrote a book. I brought it with me just in case I needed props or reference material. A Paradise Built in Hell, subtitled Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster. And I could already tell in March of 2020 that we were in a disaster and this was an extraordinary community. And I really thought I was just joining to document it because it was already looking like something really interesting in the way that mutual aid was being practiced and who was organizing it, in the feminism, in the politics of it, in the way it was answering the question of how do you, in a moment where we're all supposed to separate, how do you connect? How do you create community when communities are being broken up? And how does altruism, generosity, taking care of each other become an act of resistance to a regime bent on doing the exact opposite? And it's so interesting, Kristina, when I was thinking about like me bringing in Valerie and then a number of other people joining through me and stuff, the image that came to mind is actually from my mom's sewing basket. I don't know how many of you grew up with stuff like that, but when you have a magnet, you know the way that a magnet will run through a whole lot of pins, so the pin doesn't have to be touching the magnet. You can have it's like a swarm of bees. You can have a whole magnetized sort of strand of pins. And I was thinking of the anti-sewing squad kind of like that. There were people who knew Kristina, and then there were people who knew the people who knew Kristina, and then there were people who heard about it on Facebook and other ways. And it really was extraordinary in so many ways. And like I could talk about that in the mutual aid some, or I don't know, like it would be slightly more organic if we both had mics. But you know, we've been at campfires with joints before. We know how this works. You know, and it was also just like, it was so compelling that my original theory that I was just there to watch what was going to happen fell apart. I'm not a particularly good seamstress, so I didn't volunteer to sew, although I made probably a dozen masks early in the pandemic for members of my family. But lots of other things needed to happen. I turned out to be a pretty good online fundraiser, which is how I became the Shakedown Auntie. And there were moments of networking that were also super fun in different ways of like, who knows somebody who can do this? How do we get that done? Contacts like that. And one of the really great spin-offs happened with Auntie Constance. Do you say her last name? Pung?
Pung, yeah.
Who was in LA, was an actress, but had strong ties at Standing Rock. And one of the things Ash did that was remarkable was build strong relationships with both the Navajo Nation and the Standing Rock Reservation community. Standing Rock was mostly through a wonderful young medic who Constance was connected to. And that with both reservations, at first just meant sending masks, but quickly with the Navajo Nation, it was like they know how to sew, and one of our, as badly licked an auntie, like some people were uncles, some people were neither aunties nor uncles, and some people were just sweatshop children, but
child laborers.
Yeah. You know, so it's like lots of people on the Navajo Nation and knew how to sew. There was a wonderful moment where I got to fundraise for sewing machines and donate the money for sewing machines myself, and Badly Licked filled up their van with bolts of fabric, elastic thread, and sewing machines to bring there. And then another phase where I think we sent hand washing stations, adult diapers, other sanitary supplies, etc., and all kinds of stuff. But with Standing Rock, the medic was telling us that people were dying because they didn't have ambulance. And Standing Rock is the size of like a medium-sized New England state.
Connecticut.
Yeah. Have you ever?
Or the Lakota limb, or is it just Standing Rock?
Probably just Standing Rock
Is
because
the size of Connecticut.
yeah, because like, maybe it's the size of Rhode Island. Most things that are bigger than a bread box are bigger than Rhode Island. Are as big as Rhode Island. I've learned over the years.
To my show.
So it's they had 5 relief vehicles, like 5 ambulances, serving an area the size of Connecticut.
Yeah,
That's what this.
I'm not sure they even had those 5, but we ultimately got a few donated, 2 ambulances, 6,000 pounds of medical supplies and equipment, and a whole lot of other networking like that. And so I got to say on her Hello Kitty sewing machine, Kristina Wong made 2 ambulances. And again, it's the kind of pin and magnets thing, how things generated things, which generated things, which generated things. And I learned a lot from what happened. I have a whole theory of aunties I want to talk about later, but I just want to say something about mutual aid before I hand the mic back. People use the phrase mutual aid all the time, and I think we often misconceive it as a kind of barter exchange, that we think the mutuality of mutual aid means I do something for you, you do something for me, and that often is the case, but in disasters it's often not the case. Often the contributions are going one way, but I think it still qualifies as mutual aid, and I had to rethink, well, what's mutual about it? And I think what happens in these moments in these disaster communities is that the mutuality is already there. The premise is we are not separate from each other. We are taking care of ourselves. The fact that I happen to be the person running the soup kitchen and you happen to be the person eating the soup is not terribly significant. To quote Martin Luther King Jr. badly, and in a textile metaphor, because all the best metaphors are textile metaphors, which is very relevant to this sort of sewing squad, we're all woven together in a garment of mutuality. It's better than that, but that's what's off the top of my head. I did not prepare that part of it. And so it's really interesting, because essentially the aunties would sew 250,000 masks by the end of our tenure, and send them out into the world. And it was kind of a one-way circulatory system outward with the masks. There was anti-care, where care aunties in particular gave things to each other. There were friendships and kindnesses and birthday wishes and things like that circulating within the 800 or so people who became aunties. But it really taught me to think about the mutuality and mutual aid in a completely different way. And I thought that was really exciting, because there really is a misconception that it's a kind of bartering. And I don't think it is. It's a set of values, first of all, that we're not separate. I was very involved in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and from something the great Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano said, Common Ground, which founded a medical clinic still going, I guess we're now 16 or 17 years after Katrina, 2005. Oh my God, 18. But Common Ground did all these other things, and their motto was solidarity, not charity. And that was such a great mutual aid expression. Charity is I have and you don't. I'm kind of like dribbling my charity on top of your head in a Lady Bountiful way. Solidarity is a really horizontal, we're in this together. This time I might be rescuing you or providing you with something you need. Next time it might, you might be doing it for me. I think the democracy, the horizontality, the mutuality is really crucial. And that was one of the beautiful, radical things about the Anti-Sewing Squad, as well as the fact that, thanks to Kristina's leadership, humor was absolutely omnipresent, and but also that it was intensely political. There were apparently a bunch of sewing groups that banned political discussions, which made them boring, I'm sure, because the pandemic was fucking political. How could you ignore the politics of it? And masks were politicized. The science of masks, the pandemic, the virus, the vaccine were all politicized. Anti-masking, anti-vaxxing actually became a kind of anti-mutual aid, the idea that nobody has any obligation to anybody else. The whole idea of herd immunity is that we get vaccinated, we take precautions for the benefit of others. And the way that the right wing, in perfect coherence with all its other values, became sort of anti-mutuality, anti-communitarian, anti-herd immunity, ultimately anti-mask, anti-vax, anti-science, anti-survival, was really striking. And, more than 1 million people officially died in this country. I think the number's probably far higher than that, and they weren't even counting indirect deaths when they counted that. But, and you can imagine with different kinds of, somebody other than Trump, some other regime than the Trump regime and the far right in power, it could have been a really different pandemic with far, far lower deaths per capita, with protective stuff supplied, that in some sense the antis wouldn't have been necessary, which is to say that mutuality became political, survival became political. It wasn't even us politicizing it, so how could you not discuss the politics when they're coming from the White House, among other places? And I have ranted and will hand the joint back.
So a lot of what I've been reflecting on and preparing for this is this idea of this panel is how has storytelling changed, as writing and drama shifted. And I'd love to speak on that as a solo performer whose my show, Kristina Wong Sweatshop Overlord, basically details the 504 days actually 554 days of the beginning of this pandemic. And so my experience of time and memory is very different because I've done the show over 100 times at this point, premiered it off Broadway, and have done 4 cities, and every time I do it is weird because the audience is reacting in a whole new way. The protocol and the casualness around COVID, like when we premiered, was very strict, right? We were checking like vaccines and all this kind of stuff, and now it's like I'm talking to a maskless crowd, which. Not here. But the last theater, it was sort of like up to you, and I'm like, well, this is scary because I have no understudy. But it's been interesting to sort of when I work live, which is different than writing books, I can see my audience engaged or asleep or get up to use the toilet. Or whatever, or texting. They've been great, but the audiences have been great. But it's been interesting to see how the relationship to memory has shifted so quickly. It's only been a little over 3 years. 2 years? 3 years. 3 years at this point. 3 years and 3 months, and yet we still have to like constantly jog each epoch of this, and so much of what I'm experiencing performing the early days is hearing this like, oh yeah, that thing where GameStop was selling, oh that's right, that we had the Capitol riots, right? Like it was just so much was happening. So that's been interesting. But I think also what's been weird for me is like when I perform it, it's not like I just press a button, it goes on. Like I have to enter that time again, which was just a few years ago, but I have to play it back over and over again. So my experience of like reentry has felt a little different because I've spent so much time meditating on this time where I think for some folks they're moving past. So I'd be interested in also in hearing, is it hard to remember or you just push it past you? So the show is a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in drama. Yay me! And I'm the first Asian American woman to be a finalist for the Pulitzer. They asked me to be a juror this year, and so I read 91 entries. So basically everything that's you can enter for a Pulitzer. You just pay an entry fee, and if you decide that that's the year your piece premiered, you turn it in, and if it's turned in, the jury reads it. 91 plays were entered, only 1 dealt with the pandemic, which was so weird to me because I'm having this disassociative thing when I'm watching stuff because I'm like, everything seems to have taken place in a time before 2020 or some sort of future where it's been figured out, or maybe there's one mention, oh, do you need, like they just pull a mask off when they enter the, you know, to indicate the time, but there hasn't been a lot of stuff addressing it. I just saw one play, Brandon Jacob Jenkins wrote a play, Comeuppance, which just came up at Signature, and that sort of specifically kind of, it's about folks getting ready for their high school reunion, and they're kind of referencing all the stuff that happened in the pandemic and sort of this threat of death, but it's not necessarily a pandemic play. So I'm still curious about how this is going to be remembered in the theater. I also feel like the timeline of the way theaters program themselves, that so much of theater had to kind of program all the stuff that got pushed back when we emerged. And then there wasn't necessarily this excitement of like, oh, yay, we can't wait to watch a pandemic play. I started to have that conversation when I was on the jury, like, what's going on? Are we going to address that this ever happened? And sort of the consensus of the jury when we had this conversation was like, yeah, it may be years until this comes up. So I'm just sort of interested in you as more of a book writer, what you're seeing and how the pandemic is being addressed or has shifted how writing has worked.
It's such a strange thing to talk about the pandemic because, for one thing, people talk about it in the past tense, and it's not over. Yeah. People are still dying. It's still out there. That's why you all, thank you so much, are wearing masks. I wore one on BART to get here, and I do see people wear them from time to time. And but I feel like the pandemic and Trump were inextricable in some ways. It was just the same nightmare. Those last, for a long, the pandemic outlived the Trump regime, but, Trump, is still hogging headlines and doing crazy shit and inciting mobs. His arraignment tomorrow should be very interesting. And, but, and I felt like something about the nature of time really kind of fractured, imploded, mutated the last several years. I think it's partly something that was already going on with social media, where people live in a kind of 24/7 information drip that's sort of incoherent and unstructured. And, and under Trump, time also got so strange because it felt like the media would discover the same news stories over and over and report on them as though they were brand new. The kind of thing that would have been the biggest scandal that ever happened in any other administration in U.S. history would happen like one Tuesday, and the next Wednesday something worse would happen, and everyone would forget what had happened the week before. So there's a kind of constant amnesia because the scandals kept eclipsing the scandals. And, and it also felt interminable, the way that nightmares and traumas do, like, will we ever be out of this? Is this a loop tape of horror, suffering, grotesqueness, etc.? And the fact that, Trump hasn't been president for 2.5 years and like he's still in the headlines all the time kind of feels like it. And the pandemic felt like it in another way, where suddenly I joked that I'd been sheltering in place since the late 80s when I became a freelance writer. But still, life became really, for most people who had the structure of going to work, going to school, leaving the house, going to the gym, going to church, or synagogue or mosque or whatever, like all those structures disappeared, and time became this kind of amorphous thing that also kind of crushed and expanded and mutated, and which had that in a kind of nightmarish way, although I think it was also really liberating. I have not seen people talk about the pandemic very meaningfully, and I've thought about writing about it myself, but then, of course, the only way you can hang a hook on something for a news piece is with an anniversary. One of the things I found really disappointing is I think people had really different pandemic experiences. Some people died, some people lost loved ones, some people lost everything. They became financially devastated, lost their homes, their businesses, whatever. Some people were frontline workers who took terrible risks and were with the dying, or were ambulance drivers, et cetera, or just bodega operators and, in hard-hit parts of New York City. Some people, you know, people had radically different experiences, but for a lot of people who had relatively benign experiences, I think really interesting things happened. That's also about the experience of time. People often became really, you know, it's kind of like a weird Buddhist retreat, and everybody made that fucking sourdough bread, unless they were sewing masks for Kristina. So it's another good thing about the mask. It saved people from making sourdough. Yeah. And, but people really slowed down, which I think is a good thing. And part of what we have to do in response to climate, my main focus these days, is we need to consume less, which means we need to produce less. So being slow is, you know, being really sort of be here now, going places on foot. I love seeing that people started to walk around a lot in their own neighborhoods. They started to garden. Bike sales, garden supplies and seed sales went through the roof. People adopted a lot of dogs. I regret to say that a lot of those dogs got unadopted when the pandemic, you know, stopped. But you know, and some people had, like, I know people had nightmarish experiences being cooped up with their so-called loved ones, but people also had really good experiences of deepening relationships. I know a renowned filmmaker here in the Bay Area whose grandson, who was a undergraduate, came to live with him for the pandemic year, so he kind of sat in on the kids' classes, and he and the kid watched movies together, and he got to listen to one of the great film directors of the golden age of 20th century cinema kind of deconstruct movies. And I think this grandfather and grandson together, that would be a really interesting narrative. That would actually be a really good play, a two-person play or something like that. Those, you know, who's frustrated, who's delighted. But so people, the shape of people's lives changed radically in such interesting ways. And I haven't seen that reflected. There's been some good sort of newsy books on the politics and the epidemiology of the pandemic, but even those have felt remarkably scarce. But it is interesting. There's not actually very many books on the great pandemic of 1918, the great influenza pandemic that killed huge numbers of people around the world. I think people kind of don't like to think about it, you know, and so it is this odd thing in that everyone on Earth, just with very rare exceptions, has shared this experience, and any one body of experience would have been so worth writing about. You know, San Quentin prison intentionally infected the prisoners. There was no COVID in San Quentin. They took a busload of infected prisoners from another prison, scattered them through the prison, and then failed to provide adequate care to the prisoners who went through horrific illness, often just in their cells and things like that. Like, that alone is an extraordinary story. What's it like to be in literal lockdown in a maximum security prison in a COVID pandemic? The anti-sewing squad, actually, I got to help because I have a friend on death row there, managed to get some masks in there, but they weren't giving them protective stuff, hand sanitizer. They weren't protecting them, and they were helpless. Like, most of us, if we weren't economically forced to exposure, had some choices. We could wear masks, we could, you know, use hand sanitizer, we could not do this, we could do that, we could in some ways choose who we hung out with. Prisoners had total loss of control. So there's so many stories in it. I'm kind of an archivist at heart. I hate to see anything get lost. I actually tried to convince the Smithsonian to acquire the Anti-Sewing Squad's archives and download all of the Facebook posts.
Thank you. Thank you, Shakedown Auntie.
Yeah, like, it could still happen. And because I'm not going to trust Mark Zuckerberg's archiving. And although I do trust his surveillance to be intrusive. So it's kind of fascinating that there were so many stories and they remain to be told. And it really just feels like people just don't want to talk about it. And I think that some mild-mannered people think, well, it was very divisive, like a lot of Democrats just don't want to get into it. Republicans are still hanging on to their crazy denial. But, you know, and it's interesting given, you know, that the beginning, part of why the Republicans decided to disregard COVID was that it first happened in Seattle and New York. So they thought, like, oh, it's going to happen to, like,
those people, ethnically diverse, urban people in blue areas. And the fascinating sort of epidemiology is that because of the stupid Republican politics, eventually your chances of dying were much higher if you were in a county that voted for Trump. And Republicans lost a lot, right-wingers lost a lot of people, and the pandemic hit really hard in all those all-American red heartland places. And it must be really weird there where people aren't even acknowledging that there was a pandemic, or that COVID is real, or that vaccines prevent and precautions and stuff like that. And then another thing that's still unfolding is medical people were really deeply traumatized, the ones who were, like some people went and just did remote medicine, but people who are working in hospitals, who are on the front lines, a lot of them witnessed a lot of death and suffering and bereavement. A lot of them had to stand in for family members who weren't allowed into the hospitals. A lot of them got COVID themselves, and then a lot of them got hated on. A lot of nurses got physically assaulted, spat on, beaten, et cetera, intentionally contaminated. So there's a huge amount of burnout in the medical community. I have a friend addressing that now, emigre ER doc from Hong Kong who now lives at Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, and she's actually written a book about it. My amazing friend, Wendy, why am I going blank on her last name now? I'm tired, but that's another story. But she's really trying to address the secondary pandemic, which is medical burnout, which I think is going to affect all of our own well-being when the people who are supposed to look after our health aren't there, have quit, aren't at their best because they've been so exploited and abused, et cetera. So.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting to you also reflect back that no one wants to talk about it, and
except for you,
except for me. So that gets to the why, right? Like I think that's when there's a lot of artists and writers here. Why write about this? And I remember at the top of the mask sewing thing, when I'm running around begging people, like, if you have a quilt project you're not using, drop it off. If you got sheets, I need all hands on deck. If you got children, I need them to cut, And people were like, is this gonna be your next show? And I'm like, why would this, we're all going through this. What makes me so much more interesting than anybody else who's experiencing this? And who the hell wants to relive this? I said this, who wants to relive this when this is done in 2 weeks? 3 weeks. But what became really clear was like, there's a couple things which were the why. There were moments when I saw this, aunties would drive like all the way across town to pick up a spool of elastic to sew for strangers. And it was so scary to like even leave your house or get in your elevator of your building. And I just was so exhausted, and here was this total stranger. I didn't even know what they did for a living. And this is I live in Los Angeles, by the way. I grew up here in San Francisco. And but it was like LA is such a town where you only know people via what they do for a living and how they can help you. And here were people I was meeting because they were so generous first. And I remember just sort of like, as these cars would take off, I'd be like, I love you, like just. Where'd that go? Like, why am I screaming, I love you? Look at these cars that are going by. But that, for me, I remember having this moment going, I can't wait to be friends with these people when this is all over. I wish I had friendships like this all the time. So that was like this, and I think that's a lot in your hope in the dark, right? Did I get the title right? Yes. Is like in these moments of crisis, you really find out who really has your back, or you see a lot of panic. I saw a lot of panic, and I had a lot of that energy thrust at me, but I also saw a lot of people willing to step up. So for me, that was worth capturing. You'd mentioned San Quentin. As someone who was otherwise this performance artist who was just sewing vaginas and stuff like that, I don't know that why was I witnessing some of the stuff that I was witnessing as an otherwise unessential person? So that was the other thing that I felt was worth documenting. San Quentin, we had our Auntie Grace Yu, who's now the Dean of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State. She, you can't just mail stuff to a prison, right? As much as we love to mail things to prison, you certainly can't mail things that like have little pieces of metal or long ties around them. You have to write the warden. And it was like such an episode to get approval from the warden, because initially they said, you can sew us masks, but just for the staff. It makes no sense. Like, why are we going to just cover your staff and then like all the...
Well, they were spreading a lot.
Yeah. Then all the incarcerated folks are just like, that's just enforcing this injustice. So it was like this big, like all these little weird things that we were witnessing of these systems. At one point, Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, I'm not supposed to name them, but it was Children's Hospital, they were sent a bunch of broken masks from the government. And one auntie rushed to my house to pick up my last 4 spools of elastic, which I had haggled in cash for on the street, to fix their broken masks, because doctors were using tourniquet ties to keep the masks on their faces. Why should I know this? Why am I the difference between life or death between this hospital? So that's what felt remarkable to me and what was worth writing about. Some of the pushback, I do feel like it's not just the hesitancy to write about the pandemic. Yes, we're processing it and we're all been traumatized. But I do think economically there are factors. I had heard that and maybe you can confirm this, lit agents were like, we don't want your memoir about pandemics. Don't write me your, we don't want to be inundated with a bunch of my marriage fell apart in the pandemic memoir, right? And then also in like the film TV world, the feedback I get from my agents is like networks are very adverse to anything set in a pandemic. Anything pandemic-y, no, they don't want it. So that's also made it trickier to figure out how are we going to document this time, and or show that there's something around this worth documenting. I mean, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Did you have?
Do I have things to say?
Do you have things to say? Okay. We could also, let's see, we have it's closer now. We could also, you say some stuff, but then
You think about questions. Questions.
Think about questions. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the name that Kristina came up with immediately and how impactful that was. Anti-Sewing Squad was such a great name. People sometimes heard it as ANTI rather than Auntie, yeah. AUNTIE. And you said something amazing to me. We did some conversation during the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic. Maybe we can say that for the pandemic hangover that we're in now. Not that it was a party exactly. And about how the name itself defined the group in a really different way that I think was playful, but was also about relationship. And I loved it because I've been an aunt since I was 18. And I think of aunthood as an inherently radical thing. I've always wanted to burst through the doors of some of my family members and say, I was an anti-nuclear activist and I'm here to denuclearize your family. And that's what my essay, which I just reread, and it feels very sort of academic-y and kind of long-winded. Now I'm like, why didn't I put the mutual aid? But never mind that, it's in the book, which you want anyway. And, but I really find, the nonlinearity, ants are not the people who begat you, who control you, who are your bosses, nor are they the children who are beholden to parents, etc., that they're out of the kind of sort of breeder lineage. And often, at best, and this does include my own experience of my wonderful bohemian Aunt Francie in the hippie enclave of Camp Meeker, Sonoma County, are subversive in some way of what parents are trying to do. How many of you had subversive aunts? Ooh, half of your hands went up. It's dark there, but and so I love that too. And of course, auntie is an honorific and a role that's, there are lots of aunties in lots of cultures, and I know it from indigenous Black, many Asian cultures, etc., poor white Southern culture, etc., where auntie is sometimes just how kids are taught to regard people who are close to their mom or to the family, but are not, it's an honorific because you're not just going to call her by her first name, or it defines a kind of chosen family in a queer way. And so I think aunthood and chosen family and queer family and things like that are kind of related as these kind of escape hatches for the nuclear family, the breeding unit, and that kind of heteronormativeness. And some of that, there's a lot of queer people, non-binary people, et cetera, in the some trans people in the anti-sewing squad, was there ever a demographic study? And there was a lot of Asian American women,
You know, it was definitely very majority women, very strongly Asian American, but everybody was in it. But I thought the auntie thing was really interesting, really defined it in a way that created not only community, but a particular kind of community in a way that was very different if it was just like masks for survival or some kind of typical lefty name like that. And so I thought that was a really, there was kind of a story built into it. Here's how we exist in relationship to you. Here's how to imagine us. It had a kind of narrative power that I don't think very many other names could have had, and it was part of Kristina's genius. And I think there's an amazing story itself, because I do not think you intended to do a performance piece about this. And it's kind of like it's a morality story. Girl gives up all careerism to selflessly serve, humanity for 18 plus months, then decides to turn it into performance that, kicks her career to, all these monetary awards, this sort of huge social, she didn't do it for that. But the piece is amazing. I've seen it virtually. I can't wait to see it live this next spring, etc. But I kind of love that she gave her art up for community, and then that project gave her art something that gave her this completely amazing career now.
I'm glad you, a little, but I'm glad you brought up the auntie thing. The biggest thing I've learned is the gift of the group was calling it Auntie Sewing Squad and versus volunteers making masks or we're going to stop COVID with sewing. Because when you call someone auntie, it automatically softens. I've just sort of learned this is sort of my trick now, like whenever, like anyone, elder, same age. I'm 45 now, and it just made it. I'm still a baby. You think?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I still get periods. I know you wanted to know this. I get perimenopause. I break out into sweats. If someone wants to talk to me about how to deal with this, let me know. But but I was in sort of my use it or lose it egg years at the top of lockdown, and
Are you saying we should have solicited sperm donors?
Sperm donors, yeah. I needed sperm for auntie care.
My most recent book is called Not Too Late.
Not too late. Not too late. Jeremy Lin, are you there? Google who is Jeremy Lin's wife if you need to understand what this joke is. But anyway, what was I saying? So, but calling folks, like being called an auntie feels like a sweeter way of growing older when you don't know, like, oh, I'm not, like I'm the only one in my family that doesn't seem to be on that track of like getting married, having babies, having more babies. Like, and so something about being called auntie has been soothing about it, but calling other people auntie and making requests of the groups aunties and yelling at them, but calling them aunties as I yell at them has made it easier. So I feel like that's like if I ever, which I'm never gonna do, never gonna start a nonprofit, I'm gonna incorporate the word auntie in it just because it's easier to yell at people, make demands, endear yourself to them if you call them auntie versus, do I have any volunteers who want to do this? I need to, like something about saying, do I have any aunties? It's just warmer. So, but I did learn in this process, okay, this is my family. Like yes, I started a cult sort of sewing aunties, but like it felt like, okay, this is what my family will look like. Like these are the kind of relationships I want to have. You describe something great in the book that an auntie is someone who comes in and out of a home. What is that description? Like you kind of.
I don't know exactly what it was, but essentially, because like, some of you may have had childhoods, your parents are who you're stuck with, but your aunties come and go. They're kind of, they're often literal border crossers, crossing the borders of the house, bringing contraband in, smuggling you out to do things your parents weren't going to have you do, being more fun, letting you eat more junk food, or, try something you're not supposed to, take some risks. So yeah, I think that, and, I just want to, before we break for questions, also say one of the things about it, not only was auntie a great creative decision Kristina made at the outset,
But one of the things that may be forgotten, I don't think the book represents it that well, is a lot of the aunties not just made really good masks in terms of being very competent seamstresses, but they found beautiful fabric and made beautiful masks. And at the height of the pandemic, they would lay them out in the shape of a fan or a heart or a wreath or something. And I have kind of a passion for textiles, and there'd be all these calicos and like shades of purples to greens or warm colors or something like that. And they were so beautiful. And the fact that we weren't just giving things people had literally made manually with their labor, but giving them the most beautiful things they could make, I thought was really meaningful. And also Kristina instituted a focus on reaching out to the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the people who were least likely to be protected by the status quo. So there was a radical solidarity there.
That's why we went on for 500 plus days.
Yeah.
Well, it looked like all the hospitals were able to buy masks. There was a bunch of communities.
Farm workers,
Yeah,
there was a school for, teenage moms at halfway houses, things like that masks were given to. So that was also one of the really so the sheer craft beauty of what was done was really moving and exciting, and the documentation, like checking out on Facebook, because aunties would post these pictures before they sent them off to the distribution auntie. Is that the term?
Yeah, we had distribution aunties, we had driving aunties. We had Auntie Constance, who did all that work on Standing Rock. Her nickname was Antony Fauci, because she would literally look at political, because we can't give masks to everybody, right? So she would look at political conditions, she would look at water tables, and she would figure out where's the next spike going to happen. And because North and South Dakota had lifted checkpoints, and the governor didn't care about whether or not you wore a mask, it felt very clear they were going to get hit hardest. So she was pretty intense in how she would look up stuff, right? So we had we had super aunties who basically did the administrative work of, because you can't just mail things to an address you find online because people are working from home, right? So we had to figure out who's distributing these things. Do they really have a need? Has it been met? Because there's so many sewing groups that could be soliciting. But it was like this whole operation, and that's why and then it got nuts. We were soliciting coats at one point because Constance was finding that there were people who were very cold and weren't able to, she could track the timeline of people are dropping out of school because they can't do that walk to school without a proper coat. All that kind of, you have a coat story.
Yeah, the coat thing became really amazing. We got people both to buy coats online to send to Standing Rock and I think Pine Ridge Reservation. And we also got a major corporate donor I'm not supposed to name for various complicated reasons, but who was really lovely, who gave us about 500 pieces of winter clothing a year, mostly coats. And so in 2020, 21, and 22, we boxed them all up and shipped them to Standing Rock. And so, I think, I personally wrangled about 2,000 coats to Standing Rock. And that makes, people are really, really poor there, and it's really, really cold there. And it was really great to be able to do that. And we had packing parties and stuff like that. And one of the things that's really interesting, so I wrote a book about disasters. I think you meant to mention A Paradise Built in Hell, not Hope in the Dark earlier. Okay, yeah, but all the stories that you've been told about disaster by the mainstream media and Hollywood movies, or the ones that they used to tell, are extremely untrue. People don't panic. They don't become marauding hordes of barbarians unless they're Republican profiteers or elites panicking, etc. But most people, it's like we revert to our default setting, and the desire to help is really intense. Where you often have the opposite, which is a disaster convergence, which can interfere with rescue, supply chains, etc. It's why they shut down Manhattan below 14th Street after 9/11. So many people wanted to come and help, but there were still people bringing food to the frontline workers, trying to find what was essentially just bodies in the rubble, etc. And you know, and it was really interesting that people really wanted to help, and that this, also one of the things the aunties did is it gave 800 people, the 800 main people who participated, something to do, but also people were able to buy coats, donate money, help with other things and stuff like that. And so like thousands of people got involved one way or another. It was a really big project. I don't know of, I think there were a lot of local mutual aid projects. I know there's a wonderful one. I met 2 South Asian high school boys who organized their peers to drive groceries to seniors at the beginning of the pandemic. People did a lot of stuff like that to look after each other. And it is really kind of heartbreaking that this isn't being documented. And maybe it'll be like the Great Depression or a lot of other things where somebody will come around with a, you know, recording device in 30 years and do oral histories. But it's really fresh now. And because nobody writes meaningful letters and stuff, and hardly anybody keeps journals, it's not going to be well documented. You know, your texts will not survive. So the archival me is kind of sad that there isn't more collecting the stories. And there haven't been a lot of things like this. And, you know, there's often a local disaster. You know, I wrote A Paradise Built in Hell. I looked at all the incredible stories of survivors of the 1906 earthquake and all the amazing things they did. It's really getting ready for the centennial of the '06 earthquake is what made me start looking at disasters. But this affected almost everybody in the world. I mean, everybody in the United States experienced the pandemic. Everybody has a story to tell who is old enough to remember and, you know, record. So.
Yeah, I'm glad you would mention, like, it's not that we think we have archives and we don't. And I was interviewed so much for the news, but it was always surface. It was like, look at these women who have nothing else to do but sew. Look at the, you know, and for me, I wanted to get into deeper issues of we shouldn't have to do this. This is because, you know, these systems like capitalism and our, you know, our government have failed us in this moment. But, you know, Good Morning America, they were like, you can't talk about genocide. Can you believe it? I can't talk about genocide on Good Morning America. But like, you know, it was so surface. It was like heroic women. What's that?
I said G is for genocide and also good morning.
Genocide, Morning America. But yeah, so I'm glad that we had this opportunity to archive what we could in this book. And I did remember saying at the beginning, like, I don't need this to be about us, but if there is a museum about the pandemic, I need a small mention that's not just like Asians were getting beat up in the street, Trump was talking shit, people died. Like, I just want a small mention that people, that a lot of us had stepped up to do this. It doesn't have to be about us, but it turns out like, oh, I guess I'm the museum. Like, I'm the one who has to, you know, like I do my archive, and then we have a lot of, our Auntie Valerie's trying to do a documentary about this, and we had other aunties who are professor aunties who made this into oral history assignments for their class to interview different aunties. So hopefully those archives will also surface to the front, and it's not just a cheery do-good narrative about bored women who have nothing to do but sew for free and do invisible work for free. Do you think it's good question time? Yeah, questions or comments. Maybe we get a little house lights or comments, supportive comments or questions or things you're thinking about, and then we'll do
anecdotes, but not tirades.
Yeah, we'd take a few and then we'd go sign some books and chat more casually in the lobby. No? Yeah, James has one. I see James's hand.
So Kristina, before this, we were talking about you starting to work on some new stuff. Are you finding it difficult to step away from the furnace of the pandemic to create new stories without, like, the drag of all that trauma?
The question is, as I'm working on new things, is it difficult to step away from the drag of all this trauma? Well, my new project is sort of a jump off from Auntie Sewing Squad. I've become really interested in food banks and in general distribution, just like what a mess distribution was during the pandemic, and then especially witnessing, and I'm completely honest here, I did not understand what the Navajo Nation was. I honestly thought it was like the size of a campsite. Like, I didn't know 300 tribal citizens. Yeah, I'm naive. Now I'm learning. And but this is all something I had learned in the process of working with their organizers, like that they only have 13 grocery stores spread across an area the size of West Virginia. People have to drive 3 hours round trip for food. So that's why they were getting hit 10 times harder by the pandemic. And so this new project, I just became really interested in food banks because we have this food bank in Los Angeles, which became a huge part of our ecosystem in terms of keeping aunties hepped up on expired coffee, which I would get them to keep. So, you know, I would get these donations from the food bank and like filter them out to our aunties to keep them going and keep them motivated. But I was sending a shitload to the Navajo Nation. And so the original idea was this piece was going to be called it is called Kristina Wong Food Bank Influencer, and I was going to work with one of these gas station markets. So the in-between, imagine like, okay, I don't want to go all the way to Walmart for my groceries, so I'm going to go to the gas station, which is 10 miles away, and put together dinner. And you imagine like putting your food together, your dinner together based on like what's at 7-Eleven, like that's the quality of food. And so I had befriended this owner. I went out there, and we were going to sew this new interior of their market. This was mostly her idea. I threw some ideas out, and she gave me this better idea to steer people towards native and healthier food ways. So Auntie Germaine, who owns this market and doesn't make a profit on it, says basically our people are traumatized. So we've been, you know, they were moved off their original land, moved onto a reservation. They were given commodity food. And when you're traumatized, you reach for oil, salt, and sugar. And so this great grand plan we'd come up with is that I'd hire local seamstresses to sew this market. So you walk into an installation and you'd see traditional replicas of maize or a section market apothecary, but the food, you know, the shitty food would be sold alongside it until the idea that maybe it would steer towards a healthier way. Unfortunately, that market had to close because of snow and rain damage. They have a grant to build a new location. It will take a few years. But she asked in the interim for a ribbon skirt sewing workshop so that their community can learn to sew these traditional skirts that they wear and process these losses that they haven't been able to process in person and talk about community moving forward. So it does feel like this weird extension of, I feel like I'm doing Auntie Sewing Squad all over again. I'm trying to collect, if you ask me, I can send you a link. We have, unfortunately, Amazon, which I don't want to make Jeff Bezos rich, but it was one way to get things to very remote places. They deliver to really remote places on reservations. And so so anyway, we have a wish list for sewing supplies and stuff. I feel like I processed a lot of my trauma by making this show, which has some very intense parts, obviously, because we lived through some very intense moments, but it was sort of how I found this weird gallows humor, these humorous like moments to survive this strange, it was just so absurd. Like, am I really running a sewing group in a pandemic? Are we really this broken as the most powerful country in the world that we are like in a situation where aunties are cutting their bra straps and cutting up their bed sheets to make medical equipment for people who make six figures in hospitals, you know? Like, some of this just made no sense. And so that was sort of how we all collectively kind of dealt with it, was with this sort of strange humor of the situation we found ourselves in. But mostly what is hard is because unlike a playwright that can pass the show on to actors, once I do the show, it's like it's like my body's held hostage. It's a great way to describe it. But you know, I've been doing 8 shows a week in some of these cities, so that's what's actually really hard to think about. The next thing is the show itself is so occupying.
If the tech people can turn up the house lights, that would be great. Yeah. Ooh, there we go. There we go.
Working, but yeah,
there we go. We could use that.
So I love the orientation of the story, and I do think that there's value in looking forward for stories about the long-term effects. And I think when you talked about time and our relationship to time, I'm 68, and so there's part of my memory that goes, is it because I'm older, or is it because it was pandemic? And everybody I talk to has a different relationship with time. So if you think strategically, can you spin us a story about, like, what is a 3-year-old's life like when they're 15? Yeah. What is it like for us, and how have our lives really fundamentally, there's a paradigm shift that's happened. Like, people don't work in the offices anymore. Like what are those large-scale stories of change that you can imagine for us?
And one of the things that's interesting to me is how the pandemic and Silicon Valley are kind of the same thing in certain respects, in that they're both instruments of withdrawal from the social fabric. And Silicon Valley had already encouraged people to not circulate the way we used to, not talk to strangers. And, you know, it was constantly promoting the idea that you don't want to leave the house, that you want your food delivered, you want everything you get delivered, which is part of why, like, half of San Francisco is vacant storefronts now. And so there was already a kind of great withdrawal that Silicon Valley was encouraging because, A, they're all horrible, because they'll do anything for profit, and because they're, you know, and commodifying our isolation turned out to be very profitable, whereas like our social connections, unless they happen through social media, not. In some ways, I'm really grateful that tech was there during the pandemic because Zoom, you know, allowed me to continue having audiences. You know, I told fairy tales, particularly aimed at kind of helping kids make sense of the pandemic and not be so alone during the first month of the pandemic on Facebook Live. But it's interesting, you know, and this is a tangential answer to that thing that wasn't exactly a question, but I do think in the same way that there's a continuity for me between Trump and the pandemic, there's a continuity for me between what Silicon Valley has been trying to get us to do already and the pandemic. And they both enabled people working at home and have deeply devalued the value, and this goes back to theater in a lot of ways, and music and church and picnics and things. They've deeply devalued the importance of being with other people physically. And the pandemic really prevented that in some ways. And Silicon Valley gave us alternatives to it that were useful. But the way that that the isolation has become kind of permanent is just, you know, and was already such a powerful force is kind of distressing. I listened to Krista Tippett's podcast with Vivek, I forget his last name, the Surgeon General of the United States, and he focuses on loneliness as a pandemic of its own, that people are so isolated and lonely. Some people, it makes them really sad. It causes a lot of physical negative health causes. We know certain kinds of men lose it and harm others. It creates incels. It creates Reddit. Okay, that was a joke. And, you know, and so it's interesting how much isolation is kind of its own pandemic, and it shows no signs of letting up. And of course, people experience that in different ways. At the same time, I want to footnote that with saying, one of the things that was so interesting is I'm not a fan of high school. I didn't go. I don't recommend it to others. And
I didn't know that. You were a high school dropout? Or you
no, I have never been enrolled a single day in my life in a high school.
Was it homeschool? Or how did you
Oh yeah, by my fundamentalist parents in Marin County. No, it was the 70s. Everything was very loose.
Oh.
I went to alternative junior high school that went through 10th grade, because alternative high school was just in California at that time. I don't know what it was like when you were going to high school. High school was just the last 3 years. I know it's 4 years in some places. But the alternative high schools in my town were just, which was Novato, the right-wing part of Marin, where all the San Francisco cops used to live and sort of still do. It was just the last 2 years because they wanted 16 and 17-year-olds who could take courses at community college. So I went to junior high school till I was 15, took the alternative junior high school the last 2 years, took the GED, started at College of Marin at 16, transferred to a 4-year school. But I was going to say, what was really interesting in the pandemic is that, yeah, isolation can be painful, but there are social coexistences that are also painful. A lot of kids who were just misfits or trans or queer or didn't have exactly the right popular kinds of bodies, etc., were really relieved to no longer be attending school where, they were being tortured. And I do see school often as a process in which people are beaten into conformity and hierarchy. Our tax dollars at work. And so it was really interesting having that thing where people were actually withdrawing from something incredibly harmful. Mm-hmm. But overall, I think that there's a pandemic of loneliness, that the COVID pandemic
worsened, but that Silicon Valley, our own homegrown product here in the Bay Area, has done so much to create too and taken no responsibility for, unless it turns out it gives them yet another product to sell us. Other questions? Yes.
I'm a young writer, and I feel like my aversion to writing about the pandemic has to do with like a desire to believe that it was a blip on the screen and that my writing will be like more relevant.
Well, why don't we give you the mic, then the streaming audience can hear you.
I had a second mic the whole time.
Yeah, where is this mic?
Where was this mic when we needed it?
Sorry, midway through.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I guess my question is about
Blip on the screen.
the desire for writing that is relevant and dare I even say timeless, and therefore the fear of writing about something that was, and is these years. And I guess I would love to hear your take and advice on that.
What is timeless writing? That's another. What is timeless writing? Tell me.
I don't know, and there's so much great literature that's about the First World War, the Second World War, the Vietnam War, about specific moments in history. There were a few 9/11 novels. I don't know if they're any good. I didn't read them. But it does feel like just that, and I think, War and Peace is timeless, even though the Napoleonic Wars are over. I'm pretty sure, although, let's not talk about Russian literature today, for those of you who've been online. And, and so I think I can see not wanting for something to feel like, oh, if you don't care about the, March 2020 to, when did the first vaccine come in, January 2021?
Yeah.
Okay, the doctors were getting them in December 2020, but January 2020, let's say. And I can see that there are things people don't want to read because it's that they feel it's stuck in that period. But I also think, and it's something interesting also that's come up for me with climate. People think there should be art about climate change, which often seems like art should be propaganda and journalism. And something I'm really interested in, I've been talking about or writing about a bit, is what we actually need art to do in relationship to climate, I think, is less to do what journalism should do, which, and activism, politics, et cetera, which is to give people the facts, the information, the things to do, point out the villains and the solutions, and et cetera. But what will make us the people who are able to respond to the crisis? What makes people public-spirited? What makes people experience themselves as strong instead of weak? What makes people think about deep time for both the past and future? What makes people recognize their own desire for meaning, their heroic capacity, their altruism, etc. So I think that, there's a way that often we think about difficulties, crises, news events in a very specific, narrow way that I totally agree could feel really dated and disposable. And there's another way in which, in terms of kind of solving something that's like in the future, like climate, what gives us the equipment we need to face a situation for something that may be over? What are the things that aren't, just the news story that's over, but, the vessel, what larger things do they hold? And I think Angels in America, there's been a bunch of stuff about AIDS. There's been AIDS movies since the pre-protease inhibitors AIDS crisis were over. I think Angels in America will continue to be performed. And, although it is interesting for me as somebody who's older now and who's lived through the AIDS pandemic and a lot of other stuff, how little people remember the past in many ways. And as a feminist, there was a period where people were like, well, feminism hasn't achieved anything. And it's like, do you have any fucking idea what the status of women was in 1960? And I totally understand why you might feel that way. And I think it just raises larger questions about how do we talk about those things? What do we find in them? Why do I still like reading Thomas Hardy novels, even though I will never be a Wessex peasant?
Yeah. Okay. Another question.
Hi, I was just wondering, with the
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, you know, after World War I, World War I was such a terrible experience for people. Millions of people died, and then a lot of people died from the Spanish flu. And then in the 20s, people just kind of went crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, people were partying and drinking and doing all this stuff. And it's kind of like trying to get over I feel like it's kind of like trying to get over the trauma.
Yeah.
And writing about the war, reliving those feelings brings up a lot of anxiety and depression. And so I'm wondering if maybe that's why there hasn't been a lot of literature about COVID. I mean, a lot of the things that were written about HIV and AIDS came way later.
Yeah.
You know, during that time, people were not writing about it. They were trying to survive.
Yeah.
And right now with I think the adjustments we've had to do, the depression that's been out there, for a lot of kids, interrupting their school, their social life and stuff, really had an impact. And there's a lot more people talking about kids having depression, which they never talked about when I was young. Even though kids did have depression. It was like we didn't even know the word depression. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Totally.
I'm wondering if those writings that you're looking for are going to come later.
I think so. I think they'll come, but I guess that's. I'm not an expert on the 9/11 genre of, you know, because these movies showed up like 10 years recently, whatever, and how. I don't know. I don't have an answer to you about an answer.
I agree with that. I do think that there are certain things people don't want to think about. We have no official monument to the 1906 earthquake here in San Francisco, in which an estimated 3,000 people died, and especially no monument to the fact that about 500 people were probably killed by city authorities and the military at the Presidio because they got obsessed with protecting private property. And, the closest thing we have is Lotta's Fountain, where people gathered just a few blocks down Market Street from here, and the Golden Hydrant at 20th and Church that's regilded every April 18th, the hydrant that saved that part of the mission because water was still usable when the water mains were broken and all the other hydrants weren't. And so it's always interesting to me, like we have too many war statues, too many generals and on horseback. I do love seeing the Confederate monuments down. But it is interesting thinking, like, what should we commemorate? What should we remember? How do we remember it as sort of public monument as well? I don't know of any monuments to the influenza pandemic. And would you monumentalize nurses? Would you, I think I'd love to see a statue of Anthony Fauci, partly because it would just upset them. And, not that he's perfect and stuff, but it is really. But I think that's right. I also think it's going to be so interesting. And there's an old saying therapists have that no two people live in the same family. To be a brother in that family was different than a sister, a parent than a child, the oldest than the youngest, etc. But it's like no two people had the same pandemic, and I think that a lot of people who were kids somebody might do an oral history of people who were like 3 to 12 in the pandemic and what their experience and memory of it was. I just remember seeing a video once where a kid was so used to kind of like reaching for hand sanitizer, they were reaching to all kinds of things that were not hand sanitizer dispensers, that the world looked to them like a world of hand sanitizer dispensation. I've wondered how many kids so deeply embedded a kind of fear of contamination, because when you're a kid, things go so deep that they didn't get over it, and they still have a kind of phobia about stuff. So yeah, I agree that these things can take a long time to sort out. And I know actually that the head of the Smithsonian History Museum went and collected lots of stuff documenting the pandemic, as they did the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter uprisings, and a lot of other stuff that's happened in the current wonderful director's recent tenure. But I do just worry about always stuff being lost.
what people remember often gets smoothed off and homogenized. And it is striking for me when I see certain things from because there are things people didn't know early in the pandemic and ways we thought about it in, March of 2020 that we knew better then, thought differently about in March of 2021, let alone March of 2023. So it is, and there's a way people kind of homogenize an evolving situation to this is what the pandemic was like, rather than this period was really different than that period. And one of the things that didn't get into the Anti-Sewing Squad book that I would have loved to see was a timeline of some of what the antis were doing, and just a COVID timeline, just documenting. Remember when they'd be there were 70 deaths, and everybody would be like, oh my God, I'm gonna wear masks and isolate because 70 deaths is very exciting. And then there's a period where it's like 11,000 people died this week, and everyone's like, I'm going to the disco. Yeah. So, other questions?
You'll get that timeline in Sweatshop Overlord coming to ACT Spring 2024. Get your tickets. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks so much for this. As a performance poet, echoing the earlier question about why am I not writing about this, or why am I not seeing or reading more about this, or the pandemic in general. I'm a Lebanese citizen, and it reminded me of the explosion that happened in Beirut, the pier explosion about 3 years ago, and so little was written about it. And I think I'm wondering, a hypothesis to share and discuss, whether when an experience is too shared, it becomes so close to life that it's not original enough for a writer or an artist to tackle, that what you both have is a unique perspective on the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because as part of ASS and...
Yeah, just say ass. We just say ass. Yeah.
You can.
As part of ASS, you had a unique perspective. You were much more active than passive during the pandemic, and so that gave you almost an extra energy or an extra momentum to be able, or just a different vantage point to look at all of this. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's what felt clear was I guess this is a show, and I worked it out on Zoom, and it was so low stakes because it was this weird thing where it's I'm not worried about my theater career because I don't even think civilization might continue. I really thought we were all going to die. I wouldn't have done this if I wouldn't have dropped everything to sew masks if I didn't think we were all going to die. And I think a lot of artists had to get real straight. A lot of people had to get really straight. What do I really care about? And am I going to, go towards that if we get a chance to survive this? I think some people I know have acted on this, and some thought they would and have not. Or some, for whatever reasons, are cannot afford to do a career change, but I think oh my God, what was my thought? When I was working the show out on Zoom, it was actually quite freeing. I would just sort of run around my house on my laptop, telling these different stories. And I was like, no one's career is going to bomb on Zoom. I'm not worried about my theater. I feel like we're in the suspended moment where we all get a free pass to fuck up and to do a bad Zoom show. And in that way, I was just sort of able to just write a bunch of stuff out and not get worried about being super precious. I don't know if anyone else felt that, if you were trying to write things down or record things, but yeah, I was like, it was the least important thing was, how's my theater career going to look after all this? But the great irony is it looks great right now, but that was not, what I set out to do when I was recording all this.
And one thing, I do remember the explosion in Lebanon. And one thing I think about with climate, and Hurricane Katrina got so much coverage, and deservedly so, but there's been so many disasters, particularly in recent years, and an entire town burned down in British Columbia a couple years ago. There's more than 400 fires raging in Canada right now. There's been a lot of, and I'm a climate journalist among other things, and I'm slightly addicted to sort of scouring the news daily. But there's certain kinds of disasters, like the first ginormous wildfire, like when the town of Paradise burned down, that was a really big story. And it's interesting, in the United States, the police kill about 3 people a day.
You know, and occasionally somebody's George Floyd and it becomes, the reaction is really strong. But I worry, you know, just like not everybody killed by the police is going to have even a public memorial, let alone what the response to the George Floyd murder, which was partly, of course, because it was so documented and so horrific, that with climate, we're having so many disasters that people are not going to be very reactive. It's like, you know, like, how many of you know that there are climate refugees in Watsonville right now? I see a hand. I see 2 hands, thank you. 3 hands. Yeah, because the Pajaro River, in a very Katrina-like way, overflowed its banks because they didn't maintain the levees because they decided the real estate wasn't worth very much, which is another way of saying, fuck you, poor people. And so a lot of people, many of them undocumented farm workers, you know, were flooded out, lost everything, et cetera. And, you know, and it's just interesting seeing this kind of deflationary thing where there's so many disasters. How do you pay attention to them all? There's just, you know, and it's also kind of about where does the news go? I was actually really annoyed to see people saying like, oh, the worst day of smoke ever just happened. And what they did is they decided that one day of smoke, because there's so many people in the Northeast, was much worse than, say, the West Coast being in smoke for a month. Although if you multiply all the people from, you know, in Washington, you know, Oregon and California times 40 days, you end up with more people, but whatever. But it is just this strange, you know, of course, anything that happens where the media is centered gets more attention. But it is an interesting thing where, like, there's so much going wrong. There's the loneliness crisis, there's the economic crises, there's the, you know, the racist crises, there's the new misogyny, there's the, you know, there's all kinds of health crises happening, there's the climate crisis, et cetera, that I think one of the risks is that a lot of it just doesn't get attended to because we're all overwhelmed all the time. And in a funny way, it's kind of, I think, a successful tactic for the forces of destruction. I remember when George W. became president, there was one Friday where, like, they attacked the environment, reproductive rights, immigration rights, and I forget, but they attacked 6 things at once, and it was like too much to respond to. And I think that's one of the things that's going to make the moment that we're in, which is like many kinds of crisis, difficult, is there's so much going on, and I sort of feel like, you know, I did a lot of feminism. I'm not ever going to stop doing that, but I'm mostly focused on climate now. I think a lot of us just have to pick what we're going to focus on. I have a friend who's focused on, since Occupy Wall Street, on the debt crisis, particularly student debt, and done amazing work, and that's kind of her, you know, what she's made her focus. So, but the overwhelm, I think, is part of, you know, really works for the forces of destruction.
Should we take it? Yeah, one more, and then we'll sign some books and chat more there. I see the mic there. Cheerful.
Yeah. Thanks for this. My question is, what is driving your urgency to see, like, art created right away after the pandemic, whereas I think with a lot of the other tragedies that we talked about, it may take time for that generation to process how they want to commemorate something. Whereas I would argue there is documentation happening and micro art happening, right?
Yes.
Like TikTok.
Sure.
Which, yeah, I mean, it is. And like the short really became a big thing the last 5 years, and then really the last 3 years. Or people are writing short stories, I'm sure, and it's just kind of like maybe all of the micro stuff is happening that is documenting, and then eventually commemoration, and this generation's form of commemoration.
Yeah.
But what is driving the urgency to see something now?
I don't know if it's so much now, but looking at sort of the long form things and you're right that there's all these different ways to document now. But when I think of like how theater used to be YouTube, you know, what used to be that response that recorded what we were thinking, and these sort of long form things that maybe people aren't engaging with as much anyway. We know they are not. We know that subscription audiences to theaters are down, and that readership of books is down. But I feel like, I guess for me, that the document of the long form play in theater has a very specific weight in canonizing history or remembering history, but is also faulty in that it's not as immediate as a TikTok video, as a short that has many more gatekeepers. So I guess for me, it's wanting to, as someone who often, I'm like working on a kid's book about Asian American activism, and I'm like there's so few archives from that, because like what we have to mostly go through is major archives and what has been published, right? Those kind of things. That I go, wow, that history gets lost so quickly. But maybe the historians of the future will go through a bunch of TikTok videos and will historicize in their historical TikTok write-up, and the whole form will change. But I guess that's sort of what is driving this urgency, is to see something that I guess for me has a certain kind of weight and value. Measure and record this time.
And I'm not sure I have urgency that there be art about it, but I want there to be clear memory and some kind of accountability. And we have tons of people in this country and elsewhere with long COVID. A lot, that the fact that the pandemic could have been radically different. I saw one estimate where like a third of the people who died could have not died had we had better protocols and leadership. Huge amounts of harm were done, and I think some sort of memory, some sort of accountability, some sort of learning from it would be great, and it feels like, everybody's just kind of walking away from it, and you get an occasional news story. So I worry about that, and I worry about, I think amnesia is one of the curses of this society, of the U.S., we make the same mistakes over and over, and by not learning from the past. And so I don't think it has to be art right away. I'm not sure I'm even that anxious that there be art about the pandemic, but I'm not sure what other way. And but I think that there's a continuum from journalism, political discourse to cultural representation, that with the pandemic and related things, that people really remember, the kind of nightmare that began with the 2016 presidential campaign, and that's never really ended, because it feels like a lot of people never really got what was going on. A lot of people actively denied it. A lot of it's already blurring in hindsight. I find that people don't remember very much anyway, and I think memory is powerful equipment for being a citizen in your society, for being engaged, for making good decisions. Intergenerational memory, I think, is really important for passing on what happened in the in the past, et cetera. So maybe will the pandemic survive as intergenerational memory? We don't even have that much intergenerationality happening now in the culture. When I wrote my tirade against high school, one of the things that was striking is how much less intergenerational interaction teenagers have now than they did, 50 years ago. So I think about all those things, and I don't have a prescription, but I have concerns, and I will let Kristina wrap it up, though.
Because she is the sweatshop overall.
This has been a lot. Thank you so much for being here. We'll go to the lobby and continue to chat with you all. There's no rush for us to leave. Like a fifth of Rebecca's books are there, and that's a lot.